The Coldwell estate stood at the edge of Hollow Ridge, like a mausoleum trapped between time and shadow, its towering, black-shuttered windows forever turned inward, as though to shield the world from whatever lay watching within. It was built in 1996 by the hands and will of Elijah Coldwell, a former federal judge whose name once inspired both reverence and dread along the Maine coast. A man whose rulings were final not only by law but seemingly by fate. He was known to deliver sentences with neither tremor nor mercy, and when his gavel came down, it did so like a coffin lid. His home reflected the same grave permanence, 3 floors of cold stone, its walls laced with ivy that had long since died and stiffened like black veins. The manor exhaled silence. Servants, if any remained, did not speak of what they heard in the corridors. Visitors, few as they were, complained of an unbearable pressure behind the eyes the moment they crossed the threshold, as though the house itself were watching, waiting, weighing their presence against some unspoken ledger. Within those walls, 7 children had grown beneath Elijah's iron expectations. 5 daughters, 2 sons, each raised with the firm belief that duty preceded affection, that reputation strangled vulnerability, and that marriage was a covenant not of love, but of legacy. In the year 1861, all 7 children, Annabel, Joseph, Clara, Samuel, Eloise, Margaret, and Henry, stood on the cusp of marriage, each set to wed before the year's end. Their names, though whispered with awe in the village below, were spoken with caution, as if uttering them aloud might bring attention from forces best left undisturbed. The townspeople of North Hollow, a quiet village buried beneath generations of Protestant reserve and autumn fog, had always viewed the Coldwells with a mix of envy and suspicion. No Coldwell had ever been known to bear a Graaudan, end child. Weddings came, celebrations flared, and then nothing. No christenings, no infants heard crying in the house on Hollow Ridge. 3 generations of Coldwells had been married. None had borne fruit. Stillbirths, miscarriages, mysterious disappearances, even one bridegroom who died at the altar. The pattern had become too grotesque to ignore. The town archives, dusty and poorly lit, held clippings and fragments of the Coldwell line, all marked with a cruel consistency. Joy turned to ash. Elijah dismissed it all as gossip of ignorant peasants clinging to superstition like a blanket against their mediocrity. Yet, in his private hours, even he grew withdrawn, his eyes darting to shadows that flickered where none should be, his fingers tracing sigils carved beneath the drawer of his study desk, marks that none had taught him but that he claimed came to him in dreams. Then, on a wet April morning thick with mist, the first overt sign arrived. A note was found nailed to the great front doors of the manor, its parchment thick and damp, the ink not ink at all, but soot and something darker. The handwriting was precise, cruelly elegant. It read, 7 vows shall not be spoken. 7 lives shall be taken. There was no name, no wax seal, no footprint in the wet gravel. Elijah had it burned, commanding his children to forget it. But Miriam, his wife, watched the ashes with shaking hands, her face pale, lips moving in silent prayer to a God she had long since abandoned in the company of her husband's ambitions. Days passed, then weeks. The house bristled beneath a growing tension, like a violin string stretched too tight in the cold. servants left without explanation. Horses refused to approach the main road. Even the family dog, a silent mastiff named Luther, refused to cross the threshold into the east wing. Annabel, the eldest, was to be married first. She was a radiant womb, and poised, intelligent, and loyal to her father's ideals even when they made her cruel. Her fiancé, Thomas Whiteley, was a merchant's son from Boston, a match arranged, not born of affection, but of consolidation. On the morning of her wedding, the manor buzzed with a hollow excitement. Candles were lit. The dress, a stunning white gown embroidered with lilies and crescent moons, was laid across her bed. Guests waited in the drawing room. The string quartet tuned their instruments. But Annabel never appeared. Her room, when entered, was silent and perfectly arranged, the dress untouched, shoes neatly aligned at the bed's foot. The mirror, an ornate thing that had belonged to Elijah's grandmother, shattered inward, not outward. Not as if something had been thrown at it, but as though something had come through. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, only the soft sound of wind through the broken glass and, curiously, a faint smell of lilies despite none being present in the room. Search parties scoured the woods, the cliffs, the chapel crypts. Nothing. Elijah refused to postpone the other weddings, convinced it was some cruel game or punishment meant to unseat his family's standing. But Miriam began to change. Her face grew hollow. Her once lively singing turned to low hums that mimicked lullabies but reversed. Wrong. Uncanny. At night, she stood barefoot at the landing of the main stairwell, whispering Annabel's name. Her eyes glazed as though she saw something hovering just above the banisters. The other children, frightened but obedient, pressed on with their plans, each growing more paranoid. Joseph, the eldest son, began locking his door at night and refused to speak of the things he saw in the reflection of the hallway windows. Clara claimed to hear music, wedding music, coming from beneath the floorboards of her room. Samuel confessed in private to Margaret that he dreamed of standing at an altar made of bone, his bride veiled not in silk but in spider webs, and when he tried to lift the veil, there was no face beneath. One by one, each child began to crack. And still Elijah refused to see it. He held dinner every night in the great hall, where silence ruled and every chair was filled. Even the one Annabel once occupied. No one dared move it. No one dared remove her place-setting. Her glass of wine was always full. And slowly, fear became a guest at the table too. Then Joseph vanished. On a night of thunder and red lightning, his room was found empty, window open, bed sheets twisted in a knot that resembled a noose. His journal lay open on the floor, its final line written in a jagged scrawl. He wears father's face, but speaks in her voice. That was when the town finally withdrew. Priests would no longer visit. Vendors stopped delivering food. The Coldwells were alone, imprisoned in a house that had grown too alive, too aware of the curse breathing inside its walls. Elijah ordered the mirror room sealed. He boarded the windows. He posted armed guards outside the children's doors. But something had been invited long ago. Something that did not enter through doors or windows. Something that lived in reflections, in vows left unspoken, in rings never placed upon trembling fingers. And in the distance, the chapel bell tolled, though no one had ever installed a bell. The disappearance of Joseph Coldwell had shaken the already fractured house like the final crack in a frost-bitten wall. But it was not grief that overtook Elijah in the days that followed. It was obsession, a kind of fevered, frantic command of the invisible, a gnawing certainty that he could unravel the pattern of this cruel curse if only he could understand the ancient pages of the book he now clutched at all hours, the one the town would later refer to as the Black Book of Elijah. Tattered and bound in a coarse leather that no animal could have naturally produced, the book was not one he had inherited nor one found in the house, but rather a relic he claimed to have recovered from the ruins of a courthouse in Salem during a brief visit years before, though no one could confirm such a trip, and none dared ask him directly. The cover bore no title, only an embossed symbol of an eye split by a gavel, and its pages, filled with looping script and diagrams, reeked faintly of sulfur and iron, a metallic scent that made the nose ache. Elijah, once a man of reason, law, and the Enlightenment, took to reading by candlelight alone, his door locked and windows blacked out with pitch. He was heard murmuring Latin. Though he did not know Latin, he paced in circles at dusk, drawing chalk lines on the floor in a language no servant could recognize. Local preacher Thomas Gray, the only man who dared enter the house after Joseph's disappearance, had come under the guise of offering comfort and prayer, but he left pale and tight-lipped, telling his wife in the dead of night, "There's a second trial being held in that house, but the judge sits below, not above." He would not return. From that point on, Elijah began referring to the book simply as the ledger, and spoke of it not as an object but as a witness, a companion, a record-keeper of laws deeper and older than man's. He believed, it contained judgments not for the guilty, but for the unspoken sins of generations, the debts unpaid by forebears, bound in blood, and sealed in the silence of broken promises. Miriam, once the soft musical soul of the manor, had fallen entirely mute, her voice stolen not by choice, but seemingly by something taken from within. Her piano, once the heartbeat of the home, now produced only jagged sounds, notes played in clusters without rhythm or order, long pauses followed by sudden strikes, as though someone else were directing her hands, or she played to keep something from rising out of the silence. Her fingers bled from the keys, but she would not stop. She no longer slept in the master bedroom, choosing instead to sit for hours beside the hearth in the nursery, whispering lullabies to no one. One of the maids, a girl named Liddy, spoke of hearing the piano notes answered by thumps from beneath the floorboards. She claimed they were syllabic, like a code knocking from below. She vanished the next day. And yet Elijah pressed on, ignoring the growing madness infecting his family, more convinced with every sunrise that the book could shield the remaining children from the force, what he now referred to only as the bridegroom, that had stolen Annabel and Joseph. He claimed each disappearance followed a structure, a ceremony not completed, and that the book provided the legal framework to undo it. He became convinced that the ancient binding spells and ritual clauses within its pages were not superstitions but ancient contractual doctrines, spiritual laws enforceable upon entities older than the Church, more binding than blood. The remaining children, Clara, Samuel, Eloise, Margaret, and Henry, watched their father descend into his nightly rituals with growing terror. Each morning he awoke at 4, smeared ash across the banisters, chanted oaths from the 3rd floor to the cellar, and spent hours reciting vows in an empty chapel room, pretending to marry each of his children to shadows he claimed would protect them. Clara's fiancé was dismissed. Samuel's wedding was delayed indefinitely. Henry wept when Elijah forced him to sleep in a room lined with mirrors, claiming the bridegroom feared reflection. When Margaret refused to recite an ancient marriage rite in a forgotten dialect scrawled in the book, Elijah dragged her by the wrist into the library and locked the door for 6 hours. When she emerged, her hair had turned entirely white. She never spoke again. One of the kitchen staff, an older man named Mr. Durham, who had served the Coldwells since his youth, attempted to burn the book after hearing Elijah mutter phrases that did not belong to any human tongue. He claimed it spoke back when left alone. He placed it in the hearth, lit the flame, and was found the next morning in the pantry, upside down, suspended by his feet, his tongue missing, his eyes sewn shut with strands of hair. The book was back on Elijah's desk, unburned, open to a page titled, "Of the Children's Exchange." The town, by now, had turned cold toward the manor. Even the nearby river ferrymen refused to pass by Hollow Ridge after sundown, claiming the trees leaned inward unnaturally, and the wind there did not whistle. It laughed. Reports began to spread of strange apparitions. Figures dressed in bridal veils seen standing behind second-story windows, hands pressed to the glass, though none lived in those rooms anymore. The chapel Elijah had begun constructing was now half finished, its foundation littered with symbols carved in a language that caused stone to crack. The masons who had worked there all quit on the same day, claiming to see a priest without a face standing in the choir loft. One man bit off his own fingers. Clara vanished 2 days later, the morning of what would have been her wedding. Her bed was undisturbed. A veil hung from the ceiling fan, spinning slowly in a windless room. The only sign of change was a fresh signature ski scrawled in the margins of the book, "C. Coldwell." Elijah did not weep. He simply turned another page. Samuel followed next, his room found covered in torn pages from hymnals, stitched together by thread made of human hair, spelling out a single sentence over the fireplace, "You cannot wed the dead." Miriam began to wander, walking barefoot into the woods and returning with bone fragments, claiming they were tokens of refusal. When asked what she meant, she only blinked and smiled. By the time autumn arrived, the remaining children, Eloise, Margaret, and Henry, refused to sleep. They barricaded their doors, prayed in whispers, and begged Miriam to speak sense. But she had begun to write strange things on the walls of the nursery. 7 must vanish. 7 must vow. 1 must remain to bind the brow. Elijah, increasingly gaunt and twitching with sleeplessness, insisted the disappearances were only partial, that the children were not gone but held, like coins in escrow, and that the book had a clause for reclaiming their souls before the final eclipse. No one knew what eclipse he meant. He scribbled diagrams across the dining room table, listing the children's birthdays, wedding dates, blood types, moon phases, and even their dreams. He believed the entity, the bridegroom, had made a legal claim, a spiritual contract sealed by ancient blood, and that unless a witness of name and threshold could be produced, the final child would be taken before the last wedding bell tolled. But no wedding bells rang any more. The chapel had become a mausoleum. The book, now growing thicker, impossibly so, Pages appearing that no one had seen before began to emit heat. It pulsed at night like a second heart in the house. Servants still loyal to the family reported hearing scratching from within its spine. Margaret, who had not spoken since the library, was found sitting on the edge of the house behind the house, holding her wedding dress in her lap. When asked what she was doing, she whispered, "He's making her try it on." She jumped before they could stop her. Her body was never recovered. And still Elijah read, convinced that some ancient clause could reverse the debt, convinced he could bargain, trade, plead with the entity using the arcane legality of forgotten trial rights. He inscribed names into salt circles. He wrote the children's oaths in his own blood. He slept standing up, as the book warned against dreams. Mirrors shattered without sound. Clocks ran backward. And the book remained open, always open, as though it were writing itself now, absorbing the house, the family, the name Coldwell into its ever-thickening skin. By November, 4 children were gone. Still, no wedding vows had been spoken. No bodies, no footprints. Just silence and mirrors broken from the inside. By the cruel bite of winter in 1862, only 3 Coldwell children remained: Clara, Samuel, and Eloise. And the great house on Hollow Ridge had grown so still that even the frost upon the windows dared not melt, as if the cold itself were watching, holding its breath for what it knew would come. The book, that accursed black-bound tome that had swallowed Elijah Coldwell's soul page by page, now lived on a pedestal of bone and ash in the heart of his study, its binding whispering when touched, its pages no longer requiring hands to turn. He claimed it spoke to him directly now, not in language, but in law, offering promises, bartering terms, outlining ancient rights and forgotten clauses, each bound in the ink of dread and blood of inheritance. Clara was to wed first in January, and Elijah, desperate to cheat the pattern that had consumed Annabel, Joseph, Clara, Samuel, and Margaret, commissioned the construction of a chapel on the estate grounds. He had no faith left in God, only in jurisdiction. This would not be a house of worship, but a courtroom in stone, a fortress of consecrated logic where he would broker a final plea with the forces clawing at his lineage. The chapel was to be built of limestone, shipped from Vermont, marked with alchemical sigils carved into each cornerstone, designs taken straight from the book, which instructed that the structure must face true north, that its altar must contain the teeth of a patriarch, and that its bell tower must remain empty. But from the moment the workers began digging the foundation, the land rebelled. One man struck earth and found a pocket of red liquid that bubbled like soup and smelled like iron. Another swore he dug into a nest of human teeth. A third, a devout Catholic from Quebec, lost his voice for 3 days after seeing a figure buried chest down beneath the soil, wearing a wedding veil soaked through with what appeared to be ink. The foreman, a veteran of 5 major estates, walked off the site after a week, repeating under his breath the same sentence until he vanished into the trees. "The bridegroom wears no eyes." Clara, once the boldest of the Coldwells, now flinched at her reflection, claiming it didn't mimic her. She would speak to the window at night, not out of madness, but seemingly in conversation with something only she could see, as if some spectral lover awaited her beneath the glass. Her fiancé, a gentle-hearted doctor from Concord, tried to comfort her, only to find her bedroom covered with torn lace pinned to the ceiling in the shape of a rib cage. She would not speak during the day. She would not eat unless the food was shaped like rings. Then, 3 nights before her wedding, she vanished. No sound. No struggle. Her room was untouched, perfectly still except for a single unburned black candle on the windowsill, and her dress, which was no longer white, but ash-gray, curled like old parchment. Her fiancé opened her diary and found only the phrase "I do" written 346 times. Elijah refused to speak of it. He turned instead to Samuel, the last remaining son, who had grown thin, pale, and brittle from lack of sleep. The boy kept journals on the walls now, writing with chalk over every flat surface, trying to calculate the sequence of disappearances. "They go in pairs," he muttered, "except for Margaret. Margaret didn't have time to love." Samuel's fiancée, Ruth, tried to distract him with music, poetry, and prayer, but his eyes always drifted to the mirror, or worse, to the book. On the 5th day of his countdown ritual, Ruth found all of Samuel's books sewn shut with human hair. Pages of scripture were torn and reassembled to spell nonsense. "Beloved is the silence that weds flesh." On the 7th day, Samuel vanished from the library. The door was locked from the inside. The fireplace burned blue. His initials had been carved into the spine of the book, though no blade was found, and the book had been closed. Ruth fled the house, screaming. The snow began that night, and so only Eloise remained. The youngest, the softest, the one who still wore ribbons and sang lullabies to herself in the dark. Elijah clung to her like a drowning man to driftwood, and he swore upon every law he had ever upheld that she would not be taken. He slept outside her door. He posted iron nails along the floor. He placed the book at the foot of her bed and read from it aloud each night until his voice bled. Miriam no longer spoke at all. She moved only at midnight, placing unseen things upon windowsills, whispering names not of this world, sometimes pointing at her own shadow and laughing as though it were a guest. On the eve of Eloise's wedding, Elijah awoke in the snow outside the chapel, with no memory of having left the house. The wind howled, yet no flake stirred in the air. In his right hand, he held her wedding veil, still warm, still smelling of her lavender perfume. In his left hand, a ring he had never seen before, wrought of bone set with a gem that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. It did not fit any human finger. The chapel stood before him, though unfinished. Its bell tower was dark. No bell had ever been installed, and yet, at midnight, it rang, 12 times. Each toll shook the trees. Each toll echoed like it came from under the earth. He collapsed to his knees, and somewhere behind him the snow parted, but no footprints appeared. Back at the house, Miriam screamed, not a word, but a shriek that cut the winter sky like a sword, a sound so raw that the crows fled the trees, and the dogs in the village howled for an hour straight. Her scream shattered every mirror in the house. The glass cracked inward, and in each fractured pane was not her reflection, but the image of a faceless man in a groom's suit holding out a hand. Eloise was never seen again. Only her ribbon remained, tied around the doorknob, wet with tears that had not yet fallen. And the chapel, that cursed chapel, stood frozen, waiting, always waiting, as if time had bent around its stones and refused to move forward without her. Elijah returned to the house, dragging the book behind him. He sealed every door. He carved runes into the floor with his fingernails. He began to write his own name in it. For the first time the book refused the ink, and the snow began to fall harder. By the spring of 1863, the Coldwell estate had rotted into a kind of unnatural stillness, not merely abandoned, but orphaned by time itself. A place where even birds refused to rest on the gables, where ivy no longer grew, but only curled inward like the fingers of the dead. The manor, once a monument to power and law, stood now as a relic of unspeakable silence. Each shutter nailed closed from the inside, each door sealed with sigils carved in blood by a hand no longer belonging to man. Elijah Coldwell was never seen again after the night the chapel bell rang 12 times for a daughter who never arrived, though what little remained of him, a trail of parchment, claw marks on the floor, and a shattered ring box at the foot of the altar, suggested a mind unhinged, swallowed wholly by the entity he had dared to negotiate with through that cursed black book, whose pages had grown thicker with each child's disappearance, each vow unspoken, each wedding unraveled by a force older than the stone the manor was built from. Miriam Coldwell, the once beautiful matriarch whose hands had once played lullabies and whose voice had once calmed storms of fear within the household, was found nearly 2 weeks later by a group of loggers in the northern woods, barefoot, blindfolded with her own hair, her fingernails sharpened to points, humming a reverse lullaby that made the dogs with the men bark wildly and flee into the forest. She did not speak, only pointed back toward the estate and uttered the same phrase again and again in a voice that seemed to not come from her lungs but from beneath the earth. He marries them in silence, and silence bears no air. She died in the town's asylum 6 months later, her eyes scratched out by her own hands during a thunderstorm in September. And on that same night, the chapel on the Coldwell estate collapsed inwards without a single sound, as if the air had been sucked out of the stone, and something had descended, satisfied. The legend that followed devoured the Coldwell name far more completely than fire or inheritance could. The last will of Elijah Coldwell was never found. His holdings were seized, but all attempts to sell the land failed. Buyers reported night terrors, nosebleeds, or sudden death before signatures could be finalized. The estate was left to rot, and in its rot it festered. Visitors who ventured up Hollow Ridge spoke of strange sensations, sudden weeping from the trees, footprints that circled their camps during the night, and the sound of faint bells chiming from nowhere, as if a wedding were forever about to begin but never could. Each room in the manor where a child had vanished bore a strange, recurring symbol etched into the wood and the stone. A serpent eating a ring, inverted upon itself, eyes stitched shut. And those who studied such things would later identify it as a sigil used only in forbidden rites of soul-binding, found in a handful of obscure grimoires confiscated by the Vatican centuries earlier. Paranormal investigators, drawn by the stories and the archive records, which mysteriously remained unburned in the local hall despite 5 separate fires, attempted to map the occurrences, but none stayed longer than a night. One team, the Rothschild Society of Preternatural Law, recorded a single EVP tape before disappearing en route to Boston. On the tape, the last audible sound is not a voice, but the cracking of a veil, followed by a child whispering, "The vows must never be heard, only kept." Coldwell descendants, those few scattered cousins and offshoots in New York and Philadelphia, met strange fates in the decades that followed. All died childless. Most died alone. Some vanished without a trace, leaving only mirrors cracked in their bedrooms, candles still burning, wedding dresses they had never worn laid out on their beds, no lineage carried forth, no bloodline expanded. The name itself became poison. Cemeteries bearing the Coldwell mark saw their headstones fade unnaturally fast. Names erased as if the very earth rejected their memory. By the 1900s, not a single Coldwell remained in North Hollow, and the town itself had shrunk to fewer than 80 people, many of them unwilling to speak of what happened on the ridge. Those who lived closest kept salt lines at their doorsteps, never married in June, and forbade their children from whistling near mirrors. An old man named Levi Thorne, the last surviving witness to the chapel construction, lived to be 104 and claimed with his dying breath that the chapel had not collapsed. It had sunk, pulled into the ground by something that wanted not stone, but memory. Today, the estate still stands, barely visible from the overgrown road, shielded by trees that lean together unnaturally at the top like a chapel arch of branches. On stormy nights, it is said you can see candles flicker through the boarded windows, and if you dare approach the ruins of the chapel, what little stone remains above the moss and soil, you may hear footsteps behind you, perfectly in rhythm, as though a wedding party is lining up for a procession that can never begin. In the dreams of some, the manor appears untouched, pristine, glowing with candlelight, music floating through the air, laughter echoing from the grand hall. But in those dreams, you are always a guest, always holding a gift, and always unable to speak. Your mouth will not open. You are there to witness the wedding, but the bride and groom have no faces, and the book is open on the altar. And the bells, oh, the bells, they never stop ringing. No weddings have taken place in North Hollow since 1862. The church that once stood in the center of town has been abandoned for decades, its cross removed, its pews overgrown with ivy. Couples who attempt to marry nearby report nightmares of veils descending over their faces and being pulled backward down the aisle. Wedding invitations from residents of North Hollow go mysteriously missing. Rings are misplaced. Vows cannot be completed. The curse, if such a thing exists, has evolved. It no longer kills. It erases. It leaves you empty. Locals speak now of the Coldwell house not in warnings, but in riddles. Phrases passed from generation to generation in low voices. To wear white near Hollow Ridge is to open the door, and a ring made of bone fits every finger and none. The town itself has begun to fade. Maps misprint its location. GPS coordinates distort. Mail sent to North Hollow is returned with red ink stamped "Recipient does not exist." It is as if the land is being swallowed by the very silence that consumed the Coldwells. A silence that began with a promise, a union never fulfilled, and a love that turned into law, then into curse. no one knows what truly happened to Elijah, to Miriam, or to the 7 children whose wedding days became funeral veils of absence. But on the stillest nights, when the wind carries neither leaf nor snow, and the moon is hidden by clouds thick as grief, the old families of Maine say you can still hear it, the faint chiming of unseen bells, and the procession of footsteps echoing across land no longer remembered by God. A wedding that never was, a family that never bore, and a silence that outlives all things.